Hi everyone, if you didn't know, last August was the 2024 GMTK Game Jam. It was one of the biggest game jams of all time. Over 32,000 developers competed, submitting over 7,600 games. One of those developers was me. And this year, I somehow won the entire jam. This is the story of how that happened. Oh, wait, if you don't know what a game jam is, it's an event where lots of game developers get together to make games centered around a theme in a really short time span. Usually afterwards, everyone plays and rates each other's games. For the GMTK Jam, the top 100 rated games are then played by Mark Brown from GMTK, from which he picks 20 games as the official winners of the jam. It's a great time every year and a great way to get better at game dev. I have a bit of a history with the GMTK Game Jam though. The first game jam I ever joined was GMTK 2020, which was only a week after I'd really started learning Unity. The theme that year was out of control, so I made a simple puzzle platformer where you could run out of your controls. It actually did really well during the jam, placing 151st. I had learned a lot, I had a great time making the game, and I appreciated all the feedback I'd gotten, so I kept doing game jams after that. But every year after that first jam, whenever I joined GMTK, I kept doing worse and worse than the year before. In 2021, the theme was Joined Together. I made another puzzle platformer, this one where you're chained to a giant ball, but I ran out of time to playtest it and make more mechanics, so it ended up pretty flawed. It placed 546, which is still pretty good, but a little disappointing after the year before. In the 2022 jam, the theme was Roll the Dice. My idea for this one was way too big for the time I had. I ended up having to rework everything at the last minute to get something playable in time, and I submitted a really boring game about pushing dice around that ranked 2,718th, which honestly was way better than it deserved. 3 years in, I felt like I'd learned and improved a lot, but it hurt a ton to see my ratings getting worse and worse every year. It almost felt like I had peaked a week into learning Unity and I would never reach those heights again. In 2023, I was actually busy the week of the jam, but if you think about it, not submitting anything basically means I came in last place, so I did even worse that year. What the hell? Now, winning, or even rating well, really isn't the point of game jams. They're meant for fun, to challenge yourself, and to learn along the way. More than that, experts in any field will tell you that success is not a linear path. It's a dance of failure and growth and change, and you just have to keep on trying, keep moving forward to achieve your goals. But for me, I was on a linear path. It was a linear path downwards. Here's the graph. Numbers getting worse is scary. Oh god, what's happening? This year, heading into the GMTK Game Jam 2024, I wanted things to change. I've been making games as a hobby for a long time, but for the past year, I've devoted myself to one huge project I'm trying to release on Steam, a puzzle platformer called Inverted Journey, which you should wish us on Steam by the way, it's gonna be great, trust me. Working on such a huge project has dramatically improved my game dev skills, and I feel a need to prove it. I know I've gotten better than I once was, and I know I could do better too. Looking back on that first game's ranking, I knew I had a target to beat. So, this year, I joined the GMTK Game Jam again. The jam this year was 4 days long, and I also had work on Monday and Tuesday, so time was gonna be pretty tight. On the Friday the jam started, everyone crowded around the reveal video, eager to learn the theme and start development. Except for me, I was at work. But when I got off at 5, I checked the video, and the theme this year was built to scale. My first idea was for a platformer where you play as a character that can change size. In my head, I got stuck on this image of a pufferfish character that could puff up and grow, and maybe the force of them puffing up could launch boxes around or get them stuck in tight spaces. Maybe the push could be physically accurate and impart an equal force against you, so if we do it against solid ground, it'll actually push you away instead, kind of like a physics-based jump or wall jump. As I thought through some level ideas, the game headed towards puzzle platformer territory, which I was cool with. I've made a couple of those in the past, and I've been making one for the past year, which you should wishlist on Steam, by the way. And I just like making puzzle platformers sometimes, okay? Sue me. I don't have a problem, you have a problem, shut up. There was an issue with this idea, though. I was planning on making this game in Unity, and while Unity's physics system does allow you to resize objects, it can't do it in a way that my game idea would really want it to. In Unity, changing the scale of a physics object will just instantly resize it while ignoring physics and collisions, often leaving the object half inside the things around it. When this happens, Unity tries to push things around so they stop intersecting, but the results look terrible, don't impart any notable forces like my idea would want, and they break all the time. The problem here is that Unity uses what's called rigid body physics, which means every physics object in the engine is a static shape that can move and rotate, but can't change its size or shape as part of the physics calculations. This is good for performance, and more than good enough for most games, but for my idea it just wasn't compatible. But a few years ago, I had watched this really great YouTube video from the creator of the game Jellycar about how he got the physics working in his game. Jellycar uses what's called a Softbody physics system, which means it has physics objects that can deform and change shape when they're acted on by forces. What's better, the game even has a power-up that lets you grow your car to make it bigger in a way that's entirely physics-based. Of course, all those years ago when I first watched that video, I felt really inspired and wanted to make my own Softbody game. So I tried making one in Unity at the time, and it failed horribly, didn't work at all, and I gave up. But it's been a while since I've tried that, I've improved a lot, and I think this time I have some ideas on how I can make it work. So I jumped right into it, mostly because I still wasn't sure this would work at all, and I needed to figure that out right away. I spent a while diving into that Jellycar video, and I also found a bunch of Unity tutorials on softbodies. The Jellycar video was great, but it explains a physics system built from the ground up to use softbodies and Unity definitely is not one of those. The Softbody tutorials I found did integrate with Unity physics, but they pretty explicitly mentioned that their solutions were inconsistent and might break at any time. But by combining ideas from these videos and experimenting with my own methods, I eventually landed on this. It doesn't look like much, but trust me, this is great. You can use A and D to move around, and when you press space, the player will blow up and grow big. If I add a physics object, I can push it around with the growing process. If I grow on the ground, it'll push me away instead, and if I grow in a tight space, the player will even grow around corners and deform in a way that looks great. Here's how this works under the hood. When the game starts, the player script spawns in 10 points in a circle pattern like this. Each of these are set to be normal, rigid circles using Unity physics, though they're set to ignore collisions with each other. In order to make sure that these points will stay together and in more or less the same shape throughout the game, I then add Unity spring joints between all the points. Springs are essentially just forces that want to keep two objects a certain distance apart. By adding springs between all these points, they'll constantly have forces pushing them back to the shape they started as, giving the illusion of one larger shape. What's even better, any force that pushes on one of the points in the shape will move it, and compress the springs heading to every other point in the shape, meaning any forces applied to any of the points will be distributed across the whole shape. This looks great, but now we need it to grow. Luckily, this part is pretty simple. When the player holds the spacebar, a really big force is added to every point in the shape, pointing outwards from the center. This causes all the points to shoot outwards, up until they get far enough that the spring forces holding the shape together overcome that static outward force. That huge force pushing outwards is what gives the growing motion so much power, since it sends all the circles rocketing out, letting them push against boxes in the ground with tons of force. And because of Newton's third law, anytime you push against something, an equal force is applied in the opposite direction, letting you launch yourself like I wanted. Next, we need the ability to move around with the A and D keys. This works the way most games do, where you just accelerate the player's horizontal velocity according to the inputs, with the only difference being that for my game, I accelerate all 10 of the points simultaneously because the player has 10 colliders and not just one. With this, we have most of what we need, but there's a few issues. The spring forces are pretty good at maintaining a circular shape, but they can fail pretty horribly in some edge cases. If I fall really hard against the floor here, the player goes splat forever and will never get up until I grow again. This is pretty funny looking, but not that great since it kinda looks like it died. The problem here is that the springs only push the points to be closer or further apart from other points. So when they're all in a line like this, it's impossible for the springs to push any points back upwards out of the floor. To solve this problem, I added a secondary custom spring force that keeps track of where each point spawned relative to the center of the shape, and then adds a force pushing that point back towards that position relative to the player's current center every physics step. Now the player can still splat, but then they'll get back up in a way that looks pretty good. After that, I spent a good amount of time tuning all the numbers for the springs, forces, and movement acceleration to make sure that all the movement felt really responsive and fun. Probably my favorite change during this time was making the gravity stronger, but only when you're already moving downwards. This is a trick that a lot of platformers do to make the controls feel more responsive, and it worked really well here. Still, it's worth noting that this solution isn't perfect by any means. Probably the biggest issue is that the circles are the only colliders for the entire thing, which means that any super thin platform that can fit between them will just straight up pass through you. My solution for this problem was just to not make any thin platforms in the entire game. Honestly, this was incredibly workable, and it was a great way to save the time it would take to fix this. In the whole jam, I got one comment that ran into this issue, and the image they sent about it was really funny, so it was worth it. The problem that I should actually probably fix is that I'm supposed to be making a game about a player that grows, and right now it's about a bunch of circles that just move around. So it's time to add some art and really make this come together. The first thing I did was give it a face. A couple weeks before the jam, I'd come across this cool infographic about Japanese emoticons, which is the word for when you make faces out of text like these. I thought these were really cute, and it's really easy to add text in Unity, so behold! Our collection of circles is officially sentient. I wanted to use more than just one face out of all these options, so on a whim, I decided to make him change his expression when he puffs up, so it kinda looks like he's holding his breath in to stay big. And wow, it looked awesome, and I love him now. Great. Up next, I really have to hide these circles. My original idea was to have you play as a pufferfish, but after implementing the physics, it's looking a little too fluid for that. So I decided to switch the main character to a slime instead, partially because that would be way easier to draw. One of the tutorials I found used Unity's sprite shape to make slime characters, so I just stole that idea pretty much. All it took was some vector math to reassign a sprite shape's points and normals to match the points in the shape, and damn, that looks great and it required very little work. God, I love everything. Thank you, random YouTube tutorial. I mean, it pretty clearly has some bugs, but I can figure that out later. At this point, it's 4 AM, I need to sleep, and I hit the hay. The next morning, I sat down at my desk, and yeah, the sprite shape thing was too good to be true. Those bugs I mentioned are pretty bad. Sprite shape is mostly designed for adding art to statically shaped objects, not for this crazy softbody simulation that goes all over the place constantly. The core issue is it doesn't like rendering when the points you give it are too close together. When this happens, it reacts one of two ways. Either it refuses to accept the new points I gave it and it stays where it was, lagging behind the player, or it bugs out even worse and stops rendering entirely for a while. These are both pretty bad because both situations reveal your naked circle body, and people won't know what they're looking at when they see that. I spent a while trying to get it to work properly before I ultimately decided that I needed to try another solution. I needed a way to cover up all the circle points to form a continuous shape, so I dove into learning how to make arbitrary polygons using code in Unity, and I stumbled into Unity's mesh rendering system. After doing a bunch of learning about 3D meshes, I eventually made a new script that just renders a simple polygon onto the points that the sprite shape system was using. This never breaks and consistently covers up the circles in a way that makes sense, but didn't look as nice as sprite shape, since that had the advantage of pretty looking Bezier curves to give a more rounded shape. I didn't want to waste any more time improving the polygon solution, since I really needed to get on to making this an actual video game, so instead I made a compromise and I just used both. Basically, both the sprite shape and the polygon attempt to render every frame. If everything goes well, the player will see the pretty sprite shape solution, but if that fails, the polygon will be there to back it up and cover the circles. This cuts off the worst case scenario of the player just not rendering, and ensures that something reasonable will always be shown. There is still one visual bug where the sprite shape can render but lag behind the player, which leads to this mildly gross tearing effect, but it looks reasonable enough that I'm gonna just leave it for now and hopefully I can fix it later. Also, because of sprite shape, my console now looks like this anytime I run the game, but it's a Game Jam game, it'll be fine, I'll fix it later, trust me, don't worry about it, I'll definitely fix it, 100%. Okay, at this point I really need to make this a video game. I start by adding a goal to the game, which is to collect a star in each level to move on to the next, and I add some level transition scripts to handle that game logic as well. I block out the first level of the game, which is a simple level meant to teach how growing can help you jump, and I figure I should probably settle on the art style now so I can implement it as I go. I don't know if you could tell from the fact that I gave up so quickly on the pufferfish idea, but I'm definitely not an artist. Most of the games I've made use pretty simple shapes and color palettes, and I don't really have time to do anything more complicated in this jam either. But like I mentioned before, I've been working on a Steam game for the past year, and in that time I've learned a lot about how to make a limited style work for me, which is on Steam by the way. Inverted Journey uses a style that focuses heavily on silhouettes and strong color palettes, so I figure I'll do something similar for this game. The jam rules let me use any assets I want, so I borrowed a few rock silhouettes from Inverted Journey, and then recolored them in-engine based on a color palette I found online. By rearranging, recoloring, and layering these rock silhouettes, I can pretty quickly give the impression of a simple cave, with very little in the way of assets drawn, which is huge for me. Using this style, I pretty quickly put together a few levels which I've been brainstorming on the side since the jam began. After the first level teaches the player that they can grow to jump, I was a little worried that people would think that the growing mechanic was just jumping with extra steps, so the next level I made was meant to disprove that. Here the player's first instinct is to jump right to the star, but they're in too tight of a passage for that to work, so they have to go around and be a little more creative with the growing power instead. Making these first two levels made me realize that I really needed to fix the slope movement in my game, since they're way too slidey right now. If you didn't know, slopes can be really annoying. There are a lot of games that just don't include them at all because of this, but my game needs them so I have to deal with it. Luckily, I've battled with slopes a ton while developing Inverted Journey, which is on Steam, so I know how to fix this. By detecting when any player hitbox is colliding with a walkable slope surface, I can do some vector math to introduce counterforces to prevent that surface from pushing them horizontally. I add that script to all 10 of the player's hitboxes, and bada bing bada boom, it works great. On to the next level. Next, I wanted to teach the player that they could grow against a wall like this to gain horizontal momentum. In this one, I needed a way to help the player restart more quickly when they fail, so I added spikes that can kill and respawn you if they're touched. Fun fact, their hitbox is straight up half the size of the visual because I wanted to be more forgiving, so if you die to these, you should think about that. Next, I got to work on level 4, and my computer got really hot, blue screened, and then shut itself off. Uh-oh. Yeah, so remember how I mentioned earlier that I borrowed a few art assets from Inverted Journey? As it turns out, my crappy 5-year-old laptop that I develop all my games on really didn't like having two instances of Unity open at the same time, so it overheated and died in the middle of me working on level 4. So that's bad, and what's worse is I didn't set up any sort of backup for the project, so if my laptop doesn't get better or the file corrupts, then all the work on the project is gone forever. So I wait for my laptop to cool down, and I slowly power it back on. It works, thank God. And I slowly open Unity, and thank God the project's fine. Okay, whew. I only lost like 10 minutes of work, and it could have been catastrophic. The first thing I do is set up a GitHub repo for the project that can act as a backup in case my laptop explodes again. Little pro tip here, it's probably better to do that at the beginning, not halfway through a project, but here we are. The second thing I do is take a desk fan and park it right next to my laptop at full force for the entire rest of the weekend. I'm not taking any chances of this thing overheating again, dear God. Okay, back to making levels. I'm gonna speed up the recap here so we're not here all day. In general, my level design philosophy is that every level needs to teach the player something new and interesting about the main mechanic, and I try to build on ideas from earlier levels so you're always challenged in new and evolving ways. So next I made a level about jumping and then shrinking to pass through spiky gaps, followed by a few levels about pushing boxes around. Eventually, I needed more reasons to move the box, so I added buttons you could weigh down and doors that would open when you did. Then I made a level about my favorite thing about the physics system, which is this right here. Basically, because there's a huge amount of force when you grow, if you grow in a small area, the forces pushing your hitboxes out get so high that the friction they experience in the walls gets huge and you get stuck in place. This level forces you to do that to hold down a button for a while, which I thought was neat. I also needed to add this spring mechanic to get you in the crevice in the first place, so I added a level earlier in the game to teach that mechanic as well. Okay, it was getting to the point now where I really had a video game, but based on past experiences, I knew I hadn't done the most important part of any game project yet, playtesting. So I asked my roommate to play through the game. He liked it, which is a good sign, but the playtest revealed a couple of levels that were a little too mechanically difficult, so I spent a while tweaking them so they'd be easier. I'm making this game for a game jam, so my expected audience is people playing through it for like 10 minutes who probably play games, but may or may not be all that experienced in platformers specifically. So I aim to make it on the easier side execution-wise. By the time I finished the tweaks, it was 2 AM, so I went to sleep. Alright, it's officially Sunday, and I have work on Monday and Tuesday, so it's my last full day of the jam. The next level ideas I had all required moving platforms, so I started by making those. Luckily, I've made some of these in my past games. The hard part is always getting the player to stay on the platform. The way I handle this normally is essentially to add the velocity of the platform you're standing on to the velocity of the player. This idea sounds easy until you realize that typically the player's movement script exists, which is also trying to set the player's velocity, so it always takes a bit of retooling to get these systems working together. And in this game, it's made more complicated by the fact that the player has 10 unique hitboxes, of which only some will ever actually be on the platform. I wasted a lot of time trying a fancy solution for this before ultimately settling on a simpler algorithm that checks the ground underneath every grounded player hitbox and then averages the speed of that ground and adds that to the player's movement. This ended up working great, and I started working on some levels to make use of it. I made a level to introduce these platforms, and then a few more to play with the concept. I may have gone a little overboard with the get yourself stuck somewhere by growing mechanic at this point, since that's a solution for like 5 levels in a row, but screw it, I like the mechanic and I can do what I want. After all that, I had another big playtest with my roommate, testing both the new levels and the tweaks I'd made to the older ones. It was a good thing I did this because it turned out I had made the first moving platform level obscenely hard, so I nerfed it pretty aggressively, and I made a bunch of changes across the game to smooth out the difficulty curve beyond that. At this point, it was getting late, so I made a main menu and an end screen for the game, and I called it a night around midnight. I couldn't stay up super late that day since I had work the next morning. On that Monday, I woke up at 8 AM and I went to work for the day. When I finally got off work at 5, I knew I had to finish and submit the game that night, since the deadline on Tuesday would be in the middle of my workday. So the first thing I did was something I probably should have done way earlier, which was to add sound effects. I love game dev, but sound design for me is like torture. There's a lot of fields that you encounter when you're a solo developer, where you take a small foray into them and then quickly realize, oh yeah, people spend their entire lives mastering this skill and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. For me, nothing is worse in that way than sound design. I have no understanding of what makes sounds good or bad or appropriate for any scenario, so the method I always end up using is just to record a billion things, and then test how every one of them feels for every action in the game and see what sticks. At one point, I got so fed up with trying to find sounds for my player that I got up and walked to the store on my block so I could buy Jello, because I had the idea that I could record myself throwing Jello at the walls of my apartment to use as the sounds for the player movement. Sadly, the Target near me didn't sell any Jello, so my dreams of manically throwing Jello at my walls were quashed. This was probably a big relief for my landlord and my roommate. Anyways, here are all the sounds in the game, which ended up being a mix of sounds I already had lying around and some more that I recorded that night. After that, I added the music, and this I absolutely just straight up stole from Inverted Journey. Like, straight up, I just moved the one music track I've made for that game into this one and called it a day, which is on Steam, by the way. I think most of the assets I stole from Inverted Journey this jam, I probably could have remade myself in like barely any more time, but reusing this music was definitely the exception. I know because it took me like a week the first time, so thank God for that one clause allowing asset reuse because I do not have time for that right now. After that, I decided to try and squeeze in 2 final levels before I wrapped up the game. I had a bunch of ideas for levels about moving platforms that can launch you like in Celeste, since the growing mechanic played pretty well with that idea. I'd made sure to implement the moving platforms in a way that would allow this, so I was pretty quickly able to throw together 2 levels to introduce this mechanic, but I ran out of time to make any levels that would really use it with the growing mechanic in a deeper way. At this point, it was getting late, so I had my roommate playtest one last time, God bless that man, made a few final tweaks, and then built the game. I uploaded it to itch.io and submitted the game 12 hours before the deadline, and then immediately went to sleep because I had work in the morning. The next day, the submissions closed and the rating period started. I spent the next week or so playing and rating other people's games, and I gotta say, people went crazy this year with level of quality on display. There were a ton of cool games. I'm gonna do a quick lightning round of some of my favorites that I feel like deserve more attention, and I'll put links to them in the description. Dude Stack was an absolutely hilarious game about stacking tiki heads and exploring an island. The writing in this game is hysterical, and the vibe of the game overall is just immaculate. Huge fan. Thicket is a masterclass puzzle game about pushing vines around to make them grow and push orbs. It starts simple, but you quickly get to the point where you have vines push and grow other vines, which push and grow other vines, and it's just incredibly well done. To the Heights was a very underrated game where you have to build a tower out of level parts and then platform up that tower in order to reach the top. It's really well done. Seismic Scaling is a crazy manic platformer where the level is shrinking as you try to escape it that's super entertaining. Microbot is a neat block pushing game where you can enter into the blocks that you push in order to connect circuits, which gets pretty clever. Port a Scale is a criminally underrated puzzle platformer where you have a portable shrink ray. This one goes really crazy in its later levels, big recommend. And finally, my favorite game I rated this jam was called Picture Perfect, which is an adorable game that I love. It's basically if you made a video game out of all those touristy pictures that everyone does in front of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It's an incredibly cool idea, the art is great, and it does the unpacking thing where you slowly realize that all the levels that you're playing are actually part of a bigger, really cute story. This game is great and I love it, you should go play it. After a week of playing and rating games, the rating period ended and the results were due to come out. As a reminder, the top 100 games are the ones that will be played by Mark Brown, of which he then picks 20 as the winners of the jam. But my real goal is to beat my personal best ranking of 151st for my very first game jam. Looking back, the game I made was definitely pretty flawed. I never got around to fixing the visual bugs in the slime, which irks me a lot whenever I see it. The game's also pretty short, it doesn't really have any story, and a few of the levels are pretty finicky in ways that slip past my playtesting. Also, if you spam the spacebar, this happens. I knew about this on day 2, but I left it in because it was funny. On the positive side though, the movement mechanics are pretty fun and frenetic, the slime's expressions are really cute, and I got a lot of positive feedback on the level design. At the end of the day, I only had 4 days to make this game, or even less than that really, so expecting it to be perfect probably wouldn't be realistic anyways. Overall, I think I did okay. The game was probably better than most of my past jam entries, but it's kind of hard to rank something so soon after making it, because you lose all objectivity about these things within 10 seconds of making anything, so who knows. Would I reach my goal of beating my first ever jam entry? I wasn't sure, honestly. I was leaning towards probably not, because that was a pretty crazy result, and I just spent the week playing a lot of really well made games that I'd be happy to lose to. But I was pretty happy with what I'd made, I learned a lot, and I think I'll be happy with the outcome either way. Anyways, the ratings were officially revealed on a Tuesday, the week after submissions had ended. When I got the notification, I took a peek to see what I got, and yeah, my reaction went something like this. What? Yeah, so I got 13th overall. Out of over 7,600 games made by 32,000 developers, I got 13th. I was in the top 100, my game was one of the ones in contention for winning, and somehow, even crazier than that, I ranked number 1 in enjoyment out of the entire jam, which is insane and probably not accurate, like it just can't be, right? But yeah, it turned out people liked it. I want to be clear here, art is incredibly subjective, and I think I got pretty lucky with the rating. I have absolutely no ability to objectively judge the quality of the stuff I make, because I made it, but I definitely feel like this was an insanely high result compared to what I was expecting, and there were many games that I played and rated that could have done much better than me if things had gone another way. If you submitted anything for this jam, you've already won a huge victory, and I'm not just saying that. It's genuinely impossible to make anything during a game jam, and it's incredible that anyone can finish a game in time at all. Also, you know, the point isn't really to win, it's to improve and challenge yourself, so the rating only matters so much. So I don't know how objective or important the rating I got was, but given my history, it did feel pretty great. After all those years of backsliding, doing worse and worse of these jams, I was incredibly proud to do better than I ever had before. I was not washed, and my goal was achieved, which was awesome. I was also in the top 100, which meant I technically had a chance to win the whole thing. Looking through the other games in contention, I didn't really expect to win, but I was hoping I might get shown as B-roll footage or something in the reveal video, and I was looking forward to seeing who would make it. I did notice that Picture Perfect also made it to the top 100, which was incredibly hype, and I had the personal thought that if I won and they didn't, then Mark Brown officially had terrible taste. About a week later, the video detailing the 20 winners released. I settled down to watch it, and right as Mark started talking about the first game that had won, I heard something familiar.
Conventional design wisdom suggests that you shouldn't use a full-on physics system to drive your platforming character.
Wait a minute. That's the background music from my game. I'm about to win. And yep, I was officially one of the 20 winners of the GMTK Game Jam this year. I didn't know what to do with myself for a minute there, so I left a comment thanking him and congratulating everyone, and I watched the rest of the video. It's a good video, it's up on YouTube if you want to watch it. Notably, Picture Perfect did also win, and I was incredibly proud of them, they deserve it the most. So that's the story of how I won the GMTK Game Jam, and the biggest game jam in the history of itch.io, at least until next year's is inevitably even bigger, and a new group of people will take the title. I'm proud of the game I made, and I'm happy I got to join this jam with everyone. Looking back, while my goal was to improve over my previous year's results, I think it was learning from those older games that helped me improve and got me here now. Next year, I don't think I'm going to win again. That's just not always how the cookie crumbles, but that's okay. I know I can make something I can be proud of, and I know it's all part of the process. If I had any lesson to take from this, it would be that winning really isn't the part that matters. It's the lessons you learn and the journey you take along the way. Well, that and the other lesson is that you should wishlist the game Inverted Journey on Steam. It's a really cool puzzle platformer you'll enjoy, trust me on